Yeah. Molly, can we go to the next slide, please? There we go. And then one more. Thank you. So here we just ask that you please ensure that your name appears correctly when you log in. And this is really so that as we go into the breakout groups, the name matches your registration and your link so that we know who's going into which breakout groups. The next slide will remind you to mute upon entry. We also, that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on MSDE's YouTube channel. And if you need a translation into Spanish, this slide walks you through that. Also, if you require closed captioning, the bottom of the slide walks you through that process. So with that, I will hand the microphone over to Dr. Deanne Collins, the Deputy Superintendent for the Office of Teaching and Learning. And Molly, can you move to the next slide, please?
Great, thank you, Carmen. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're enjoying your summer so far and are enjoying the interesting weather we've been having. Bringing you greetings on behalf of Dr. Wright as well. Dr. Wright had a personal conflict today, but she will not be here, but she's well aware of what we're doing. I think Liz and I and the team are pretty excited about today's meeting. We've had lots of conversations around the proposed recommendations, and so once again, we will get into, after we review the June meeting, more into proposed recommendations and some of the ideas we think that will help us to continue to engage with you, but also get your feedback and kind of solidify some of the recommendations. And we're also super excited because today we're going to talk about significant disproportionality, norm on what it means, what it currently looks like in Maryland. And then there will be a lot of time today, though, like to get input and feedback from you on suggestions and recommendations. And so we're super duper excited. As many of you probably know, it's a very hot and appropriate topic across many states that are trying to resolve and figure out. And the Federal Office of Special Education has been thinking about this and grappling about this and trying to provide some technical assistance as well. And so I think it's great that the work that we're trying to do here in Maryland and the conversations that we're having to figure out how do we get better in Maryland is very timely. And I really do think we'll have some robust conversations. And I'm really hoping, we're hoping, Liz and I too, that you all are leaning into the conversations today to provide some concrete recommendations and suggestions about how we can address it. So make sure you make good use of the breakout groups today. And Dr. Hickman is going to spend more time than in the past groups going through the pre-reading, but also telling you about what's happening in Maryland just to level set. So super duper excited about today's meeting. I'll turn it to you, Liz, for anything before we go to public comments.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to quickly say, this summertime, I know folks are probably doing, as I am, a little bit of time to do some reflection and some professional learning. I'm excited to hear about some of the things that are happening around the state. I know Anne Arundel County has a real exciting professional development coming up this week. I spent last weekend in Phoenix, Arizona, where it was really, really hot, like behind a bus exhaust kind of hot, at the National Down Syndrome Congress, which I attend every summer. About 4,000 people there, and always a really wonderful weekend. But I spent a lot of time in sessions about education, as you can imagine, about reading instruction and inclusive post-secondary programs and universal design for learning, and most especially talking to some adult self-advocates, which is always, really the best part of the weekend. I met a young man who attended a 4-year inclusive post-secondary program for students with intellectual disabilities with inclusive living at George Mason University. The really remarkable thing, aside from just the existence of that longstanding program and how successful it is at preparing young people for employment, is that his family lives in California, and he spent He spent those 4 years living on the East Coast on a college campus. You can imagine just how life-changing that is. And so that was a really important conversation for me. But, you know, throughout those conversations, the themes that were coming up are the same things we've been talking about for the last year together: high expectations, evidence-based practices, you know, training for teachers, administrators who lead teams with that focus on inclusionary practices, data, and outcomes, outcomes and not just compliance. And you know, as I told people about the work that we've been doing here in Maryland, you know, it really struck me again, just the conversations that we're having are the same conversations that are happening everywhere, but the opportunity that we have in the blueprint and in this work group to come up with concrete suggestions to move our state forward and to improve things for students with disabilities is really quite something. And the commitment of MSDE and all of you to this process is what's making it possible. So thank you for being here and for bringing your experience and expertise even in the middle of the summer. And on with the show. But this, you know, as Dr. Collins said, this is a really important topic, and I'm glad we're gonna lean into it today.
Thank you, Liz. So our next slide will just remind folks of our guiding question today, which is, what recommendations do you have on specific steps that MSDE can take to help local education agencies reduce disproportionality? And I do, like Liz, hope that this will be a very robust conversation. The next slide would be for public comment, but no one has registered today. So we will move right into the highlights from our June meeting and go back to Liz.
Okay, so you will recall that we spent our June meeting talking about the least restrictive environment. We got a lot of great feedback, as always, in the exit tickets and pulled from your small group discussions. And those were circulated, that feedback was circulated to you. I'll just sort of high level it here. We asked about factors that you found that contribute to the variability in placement among LEAs by disability, by race, and by assessment type. And, you know, many of the things you would expect came out of that: the capacity of general educators and training, staff shortages, implicit and explicit bias, whether that is racism, ableism, bias against non-English speakers or non-speakers, low expectations, lack of accountability, a focus on behavior rather than student needs, fidelity of implementation, and then a lot of real specific, you know, things that we also have talked about: master schedules and a lack of accessibility, things like that. Then we got feedback on standards, policies, and procedures that might decrease variability and increase placement in general education classrooms. And again, many of the topics that we've covered came up: a need for increased resources and standards for resource allocation, staffing allocation standards, monitoring and enforcement, and including more documentation and justification for when an IEP team wants to move a student to a more restrictive environment, staff knowledge and training, and clear standards for disability category eligibility. So then the next bit was on supports that MSDE can provide to increase capacity of schools, training, professional learning, clear guidance on things like supplementary aids and services, implementing specially designed instruction and co-planning, evidence-based practices, family engagement, which is something we haven't talked, has come up a lot. We haven't had a deep dive on it yet, but we will. But family engagement for families to really understand least restrictive environment and how important it is. And processes for LEAs and schools to get additional support. And then finally, we talked about, we asked for feedback on how we can share expertise and the specialized supports that are often available to students in separate schools, to make sure that that information gets to educators and supports educators in less restrictive environments. And people talked about formal mechanisms for sharing that kind of expertise, and making sure that there are outside resources and information available to our educators and our schools. So we took all of that, we sent that out to you, and we distilled it then into a recommendation, which we're going to look at now together. And hopefully everybody got a chance to review that. This one starts with a sort of little preamble here that sort of references what I just said, that a lot of the recommendations we've already made will contribute to solving the problems that we talked about, that variability and least restrictive environment data. So it starts off many of the standards, policies, and procedures that we've suggested are also essential for increasing placements of students with disabilities in general education classrooms and decreasing the variability of Maryland's LRE placements. These previous recommendations include the achievement of grade level standards by all students with disabilities, establishing the legal requirements of the IEP process, and holding LEAs accountable for implementation, increased resources, standards related to evidence-based specially designed instruction, staffing plans and service delivery models, and positions like paraprofessionals and IEP chairs, direct support and coaching for IEP teams and LEAs from MSDE, and ensuring that educators and administrators have the requisite knowledge, skills, and expertise through educator preparation programs, professional learning, and licensure requirements. So sort of doing all of the things we've already talked about, implementing those recommendations with an eye, in addition to academic achievement, which is one of the things we've talked about, but also thinking about placement as part of that. So next slide, and we will look at the additional piece. So in addition, the work group recommends that MSDE should develop a plan for a plan with specific tasks and timelines within 60 days to decrease variability of LRE data by LEA, race, disability category, and assessment type, and increase placements in general education classrooms, decreasing placements in LREC and separate schools. And the plan should include, first, standards, guidance, technical assistance, and monitoring focused on the use of supplementary aids and services, implementation of evidence-based specially designed instruction, eligibility determinations for disability categories, MTSS implementation, and master schedules. And then the next slide has the couple additionals. LEA action plans on least restrictive environment that are reviewed and approved by MSDE with mechanisms for accountability. Support from MSDE to increase the capacity of schools to meet the needs of all students, including guidance on seeking out and providing additional resources and support throughout the year. Direct consultation with inclusion experts where staff can bring questions, issues, and particular student situations. And formal mechanisms for sharing expertise and connecting schools and LEAs to outside experts, professional learning, and mental behavioral health experts. And then finally, additional requirements for documentation, justification, and review for moving students to more restrictive environments, particularly the most restrictive environments. So that is the proposed recommendation. And I'm happy to hear your thoughts.
I had one thought. One of the things I noticed in the recommendations, this is David Stone, by the way, was a lot of attention to additional paperwork. And I know that one of the great complaints about special education is the amount of paperwork that already exists. It seems like a lot of documentation and paperwork mechanisms that would just really bog down the system. And I'm wondering if there's some way that we can figure out how to cut down on the red tape of working with kids and families. I'm sure that they're not interested in more paperwork, especially teachers and schools.
I'll respond to that. Thank you for that. This is Dr. Hickman, Assistant State Superintendent. We do not want to have more paperwork, but we do want to ensure that students are moved appropriately. If there is a need for them to be in a more restrictive environment, we want to make sure that it's really intentional, thoughtful, and justified. But as we navigate the process and develop the plans, we will still try to keep the paperwork lean So just because the requirements for documentation, we're going to try not to increase the amount of paperwork, if that makes sense.
It does, but I thought that this information was already required on the IEP. Any justifications and things like that. I mean, of course, the information is important, but I thought it's already written down somewhere. So basically, you'd have to record it twice.
Well, maybe within the IEP, it can be more detailed as well. There are some concerns that students are moved or even recommended for a more restrictive environment without
And we think more
necessarily.
paperwork will solve that problem?
No, I think more thoughtful and intentional attention to it may do so. But that's just one piece of the recommendation. It says additional requirements for documentation. We can look at that, but it's really about justifying and being intentional and thoughtful about the student's needs.
If I could just jump in here, this is Josh Schechter. You know, this is already happening with more paperwork. I've said it before, and I'm going to say it again. The Appendix A went from, which is looking to, justify students being instructed with alternate achievement standards, went from, I believe it was like a 7-page document to a 17-page document. And anyone who has given
We seem to have lost you, Mr. Schechter. Are you still there?
I still see his name. I don't.
hold on, I'm here.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So again, the DLM document has gone from, I believe, a 7-page document to about a 17-page document. Anyone who has given the DLM assessment to a student, it is a time-consuming assessment. It is nowhere near the amount of time that the general ed assessment is. I mean, you do not give a student a
We lost you again, Mr. Schechter. I'm going to jump in just to say, and if you come back, please interrupt me. I'm just going to jump in to say, the reason why we're talking about making sure that there's robust documentation for these decisions is because of the really profound consequences they have for students. And because we have had since the requirement to stay under the 1% for the alternate assessment was instituted with the reauthorization of ESSA in maybe 2016, we've always been above that 1%. And so we know that we are identifying students who should not be identified for the alternate assessment to take that assessment. And it has really profound consequences for students. So, I think one of the things that's important is to keep in mind as we're thinking about what documentation is important and what paperwork is important, the paperwork that has the most and around decisions that have the most impact and long-term consequences for students certainly should be ones where we have robust requirements for teams that show their deep thinking.
I mean,
very curious to hear from the folks.
Hold on, if I could just jump in here.
Sure.
My IEPs already take an hour to, like, IEP meetings, just going over required, requirements and information. They take over an hour already, an hour and a half when you have to bring in an interpreter. And I'm just saying let's. Sorry, I'm back. My phone keeps on jumping out. But if we're really going to be pushing for full inclusion, let's just not like wave our magic wand and say, okay, everybody's included without really putting the supports in place and really not trying. I mean, just at my school for ESY, we had not one, but 2 teachers quit in the middle of ESY. So that should tell everybody that we really have a problem getting people and adding more paperwork, even though at this level it looks like we're being more robust, we're pushing people away.
Well, thank you for that. Someone else going to add in? I'm just going to say you're correct in your thinking. We are not in any way, we don't want to increase the amount of paperwork that's necessary. We actually want to find a way to reduce the paperwork as well as the workload. This recommendation just came from the team. I'm sorry, from this work group. If there's anyone else that wants to speak to it, please do.
Dee, you're up next.
Hi, thank you. So I'm going to put my parent hat on here, sitting on the other side of the table with this. I understand the need for the additional, I don't look at it as additional paperwork. I look at it as an additional justification and triple checking boxes as to whether this is something that is definitely in the best interest of the child. Going through this process with my son when he was in high school, he was on the diploma track the entirety of his schooling, and the 11th grade, the team just threw on me that they wanted to remove him off of the diploma track to the special education track. And that decision shouldn't have been so easy. Fast forward, I did not let that fly. However, I think it should be more difficult for people we're talking about IEP teams, to make these decisions that are life impacting for people with disabilities, many of whom can't make these decisions for themselves. So in essence, you're making a decision based on the ease of being able to make that decision. And I appreciated the longer IEP meetings because it allowed time for discussion. Even as me being an advocate, I needed that consistent engagement and conversation. I have so many parents' rights and responsibilities books, I know it by heart, but still going through that process, I needed those goals and objectives and options and everything explored before making a decision, a final decision, because it's also not as easy to reverse them once a team is decided. So I understand the inconvenience of the additional paperwork, but it helps everyone at the table be on the same page and understand where you're moving forward and where things are lost. I mean, I know my son's IEP by the time we finished was probably 100 pages over the course of his K through 11 career. So from the other side of the table, I honestly appreciated more paperwork, more discussion, and IEP meetings that lasted longer than 30 minutes. I'm done. Thank you.
I mean, go ahead. Take me out of the classroom then for 2 or 3 days to work on one meeting. You know what? Whatever you guys want to do is fine. We don't need to, as we said last time we met, with calling us folks in separate schools, calling us segregationists. Just let's not have a philosophical debate on it. Whatever you guys want to do is fine. Take me out of the classroom to do an IEP for 3-4 days. Why not the whole week? Then we'll make sure everything will be nice and robust.
Josh, I do want to chime in and mention, though, everybody's voice matters. And so we want to honor your perspective. And today is we don't have to make any decisions. So I just want to say that I appreciate, MSDE does, and the group here, we appreciate everyone's perspective. And we need to hear from everyone on this. And we do not need to make any decisions today. This is why, this is a healthy conversation to have, because it's not a black and white decision. Like, we need to have a discussion. So I just want to reiterate that. I don't want you to feel like we're making a decision or cutting anybody off. It's good to hear different perspectives. And so we appreciate your thoughts.
You're
think
welcome.
Agatha had, her hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to chime in and say, I do not, from where my perspective, working with families, who have students who significant disabilities, and they've had to advocate for years and kind of fight. They use the words fight, struggle to get their kids more services, possibly in a more restrictive environment. It's not an easy process now. It's never been described to me as that. So I just want to make sure we're being sensitive to that. Families spend a lot of hours, money, tears, frustration, trying to find the right guidance for their child. So I just want to make sure that we're sensitive to that. It is already an arduous process. I think the public school principals and people working on the front lines feel the same way. It's not easy to get a child into a more restrictive environment now. And I do feel like this set of recommendations in particular is more focused on a symptom, which is we're seeing an over-identification or overutilization of more restrictive settings. But really what we've talked about as a whole, I've been feeling like the issues we seem to have clarity on are a lack of having the appropriate supports in that less restrictive setting, or maybe it's staffing or training and all the things we've talked about. So I feel like this doesn't really get it. It's a symptom, but it's not the problem. So I just want to just go on record with that.
Okay, so as we're looking through this, there's been some robust conversations. Is there any other conversation? Anyone else?
Yeah, so this is Leslie Margolis. I had my hand raised, but maybe I didn't show up. This is such an emotional flashpoint for people, but I think it's really important as members of the work group that we come to the table recognizing that people have different perspectives and that we respect those and that we're able to have meaningful conversations. What I want to say as, a lawyer who's been doing this work for a very, very long time is that what we're talking about when we talk about least restrictive environment is not something nice, something we like, something we don't want. It's what the law has required since 1975. It requires a continuum, that there be a continuum in place. And I think what we're recognizing when we look at the data is that Maryland has tended to skew very much towards the restrictive end of that continuum. Since I've been doing this work, we have always ranked in the top 4 or 6 in the country for putting kids into separate special education schools. And it's not because the students in Maryland are more disabled than students in other states. There is a systemic barrier here, and there has been lots and lots of effort on the part of MSDE, on the part of local school systems, on the part of advocates to change that skew, and it's been really resistant. So this is an opportunity for us as we look at the blueprint and we look at the amount of money that's coming to school systems to really try to figure out why is this, and how can we move ourselves forward to ensure that each child with a disability is placed in the least restrictive environment in which their needs can be met. And this is a way of beginning to get us there. I also, just as a parent, in addition to being a lawyer, want to respond to the issue about length of time of meetings. I had a very lengthy IEP meeting for a client this morning. I've had meetings for my own child when she was in the school system. You have to take the time that it takes to work with families. And when that process is really collaborative, when people are really sitting around the table, brainstorming and doing interdisciplinary stuff, it takes time. But feeling as a parent, it's hard not to feel resentful when the response is it's all about the imposition of paperwork and it's a burden, and meeting with you about your child is a burden and it's taking me away from other responsibilities. Those responsibilities are part of the job. Nobody wants paperwork that is just there for the sake of being paperwork. It's figuring out what will move us forward in our common goals to ensure that every child is safe, is comfortable, is educated appropriately, and has the opportunity to be educated in the least restrictive environment they can be. So that's all I want to say.
Thanks, Leslie. David?
Thank you. Oh, let me see.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that my issue was not redundance, was not time and imposition. The time that it takes is the time that it takes. My concern is that it's redundant, that these mechanisms already exist and there's no need to go through them 2 and 3 times. The IEP meeting is the place where this is supposed to happen. What we need to do is have the robust conversation at the IEP meeting and make the correct decision there, rather than adding layer after layer and second guessing people. I think that the IEP team is the best group of folks that are equipped to make that decision. So why not strengthen that process, do the paperwork once and get it right there? No one's objecting to the need to examine this. It's critically important. We want to move kids to be in the best environment possible. We do have a continuum, let's not forget it, and each place on the continuum is important. Nevertheless, I understand what the law says too. And when it's appropriate, a child should move. But the IEP meeting is where that decision needs to happen, because we don't have an unlimited resource of people out there teaching and monitoring classes. So it's a trade-off. It's a zero-sum game. So you got to decide, do you want people in the classroom teaching, or do you want people outside of the classroom repeating work that they've already done at the IEP meeting? That's just my opinion on that. I just want to make sure that you don't think that I think that it is an imposition, just redundant.
Well, and
Thank
I
you.
don't necessarily, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Hickman.
No,
Sorry.
I think if in the essence of time, if you don't mind, Liz, I'll say and then you respond.
Oh, hold on.
We-
I need to jump in here as a
Hey,
teacher.
and
Hold on,
excuse me,
Josh.
Mr.
Just-
Schechter, hold on just a second. Dr. Hickman is talking.
Okay, fine then.
Thanks. I wanted to say, obviously, we are not at a point of gaining consensus on this, and it does look like we need to take it back. We've had some new input from those on the call, more so than what we received in writing or in our request for feedback during our exit, So if it's okay with the committee, we would like to just table this one and come back and tweak it and maybe make some adjustments to the language. What do you think about that, Ms. Zogby?
Yeah, I want to make sure that I have the feedback. It sounds to me like what we're talking about is a greater, is to make sure that it's clear in the recommendation that we're not talking about piling on additional paperwork or redundancy, but at the same time, making sure that we're focusing on students and student needs, and making sure that the first time that the paperwork gets done, it gets done correctly, and that there is, and I just want to respond to one other thing that was said, which is that about the symptom. I do think that there, this piece about the documentation, and the piece about the action plans may seem like they are addressing the symptom, but the rest of the recommendation in thinking about standards and guidance for supplementary aids and services and so on, and making sure that we're sharing expertise, are really, I think, focused on the other piece of that, which is really kind of trying to address some of the things we know are need to happen before the decision gets made, if that's helpful. But I agree, Dr. Hickman, I do know that we want to move on. Buzzy, you want to chime? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I didn't see Buzzy. Go ahead. Oh, you was, wait a minute. Josh was going to say something first and then Buzzy. I think you should go in that order.
Okay, sounds good.
I just want to state, it's not when it gets done, it gets done. Teachers are contracted to work, 8-hour days. We should not be expected to go home and stay up to 2 to 3 in the morning working on 100-page IEPs. That takes away from our classroom planning. It takes away from working with the students. That's all I have to say about that.
Thank you for that. And we didn't, again, our goal is not to increase the workload or the paper load. So, Buzzy?
Yeah. I don't think anyone disagrees. So rather than take it back, what about an amendment to the last check? Strike additional and say requirements for documentation, et cetera, subject to review to assure that there is no redundancy or unnecessary paperwork.
Can we add that to the recommendation? I'm only pushing for time. We have a very important topic for tonight. we can bring this back around. We have more time to do that. We can even discuss it and some other opportunities we plan on presenting for this month of August. So can we just pause and rework it? Mr. Hedelman, we will take your consideration as one of the recommendations to remove additional, but we do want to focus more on the supports. Can you go back one slide, please? This just speaks to what Ms. Zabi was speaking of. There's more to that recommendation than the last part about additional paperwork. And we just totally, we couldn't see that on the screen, but just wanted to make that a point.
Yeah,
So,
and the one other point I want to just make is remember everyone that the idea here is that MSDE is going to create a plan for a plan using these points as kind of guidance for that plan. And so it was taking the feedback that we got and saying, here, don't just come up with a recommendation about LRE, but here's some guidance for that plan and implementation development that's based on the rich feedback that we got from everyone. It seems like that last point is the point that folks are concerned about. Might I propose that we go ahead and approve the rest of the recommendation if people are not concerned about that, and we'll bring back that last piece with a little bit of tweak, with new language based on what Buzzy just said, recapping some of that. How do people feel about that idea so that we can move on?
I'd rather we rewrote the whole thing. I mean, we vote on it when it's all rewritten in case.
When it's okay, bring it back as one.
Right.
Okay, that's fine with me.
It's just me.
Me too.
Okay. All right, we'll bring it back. We'll bring it back at the next meeting. All right.
It's on you one more time, Mr. Zabi.
Okay, so
Next
we are
slide,
now.
next slide, please. Also, we're just so for clarification, we will bring it back at our next meeting. Thanks.
All right. So if we could advance a couple of slides, we are going to now start with our topic for this evening, a few minutes late, on significant disproportionality. So, this really, I'm just going to take 2 minutes to just put this in the context of the topics we've covered. So our charge is, of course, making recommendations for improving the educational experiences and long-term outcomes for students with disabilities. We've done that by, started with the data. We laid the expectations and standards. We talked about the integration of general and special education, the frameworks, MTSS, UDL, specially designed instruction, continuous improvement, teacher training and professional learning and retention, staffing, service delivery, funding. We got to that point, and then we turned to least restrictive environment. And now tonight we turn to significant disproportionality, the inappropriate identification of students for special education or for particular disability categories, inappropriate placement in more restrictive settings that limit student access to general education classrooms and to their non-disabled peers, and inappropriate use of disciplinary measures that negatively impact student outcomes based on race or ethnicity. So those, that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And like with least restrictive environment, we're thinking about patterns of practice that are quite pervasive, and that many of the solutions we've talked about already are part of the process of redress for these least restrictive environment and significant disproportionality, part of solving those complex challenges. So tonight we're going to look at the methodology for determining significant disproportionality, the choices that Maryland's made for doing that, the specifics of our data and the trends here, what we've tried so far, and to think about why it hasn't always been effective, and what we should do going forward. So I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Hickman to dive into some of these details, and I'm looking forward to small group conversation.
Not a problem. Thank you. So as we start off with the slide, the title of Equity in Special Education, it's been stated several times today and in the reading. This isn't new. I would like to say to you personally that over my career, several key opportunities where I've had to write or do research on the topic of disproportionality, overrepresentation. The title has changed. The title hasn't always been the term significant disproportionality. As if you go back in history, the overrepresentation of African American males and boys in special education, emotional disability, all the way back to MR, TMR, EMR, all the acronyms that some of us may know. But just sharing with you that identifying and addressing this it's been a required component in IDA for a long time. What's changed in recent years is just the need to refine the process and enhance the effort on equity. Equity being recognizing that we do not all start from the same place, and we must acknowledge and make adjustments to the imbalances. So provisions to monitor disproportionality in identification and placement were first introduced in IDA 1997. Then in 2004, IDA reauthorization, provisions were strengthened to include disciplinary removal in the identification of significant disproportionality and the additional requirement of enforcement when significant disproportionality was found. So revised regulations became necessary as a result of the Government Accountability Office in 2013, finding that a very few districts were being identified by their states as having significant disproportionality because they were in charge of their ratios or their methodology. In fact, in any given year, before 2016, Maryland identified between 2 and 4 LEAs as significantly disproportionate, which accounts for about 8 to 16% of our LEAs. Recognizing the great variability amongst the states, it was like comparing apples to oranges for federal oversight and accountability, which made the identification of significant disproportionality unlikely and comparison among states very difficult. So with this reality check, federal changes and required methodology components became the law. Next slide, please. It's me, not you. Well, I'm trying to get my computer. So if you see here from this slide, you'll see that when Maryland took a look at this, they developed, looked at the two work groups and similar to this, cast a wide net to get input. They created a revised methodology for significant disproportionality so that it would shine a light on the system's inequity issues. Stakeholders were involved, as you see from the bullets. One was looking at our state advisory council, including the strong parent voice. And then another group included an array of state and local leaders, advocates, school staff, and organizations with an equity focus. So this was not just MSDEs, but it was a community taking charge, showing their concern, and recognizing that there was some systemic issues statewide that needed to be changed. So the methodology recommendations from the stakeholder groups were ultimately presented to the board for publication in December of 2017, and the methodology was adopted in May 2018. Next slide, please. As you can see here from the disproportionality methodology, the things that I'm sharing again are in alignment with our pre-reading, alignment with our conversation. This chart provides a comprehensive but concise summary of Maryland's current significant disproportionality methodology with the IDA component parameters for Maryland's decisions to use the flexibility option. So significant disproportionality is determined annually for each of Maryland's local systems. So if we look at the categories of analysis, there are 3 overarching buckets. There's identification, placement, and disciplinary removals. Within each bucket, there are specific categories of analysis that can lead to the determination of significant disproportionality. In total, there are 14 categories represented by the open circles, circle bullets. And for example, within the bucket of placement, there are 2 specific categories of analysis. In regular education, less than 40%. And inside separate schools or residential facilities. Either one of these may identify significant disproportionality. But to note, there's a heightened focus in comparison to previous required categories of analysis and disciplinary removal, including both short and long-term and out-of-school suspensions. Let's look at the population. If you look at the population, we apply the categories of analysis for identification and disciplinary removal only for students aged 3 through 5. All three buckets of analysis were analyzed for students aged 6 through 21. Across the IDA requirements, Maryland established its methodology with flexibility options. So first, IDEA requires a consistent risk ratio as the basis for decision-making. Maryland has always used risk ratios, and IDEA allowed each state to choose the risk ratio threshold. Maryland is one of 4 states to adopt the most stringent risk ratio threshold of 2.0, with other states ranging from 2.0 to 7.0. I just want to pause there just to bring attention to that again, Maryland is one of the 4 states to adopt the most stringent risk ratio threshold of 2.0. Some of you may know that I most recently left a state down south, and we sat and participated in trying to develop a similar ratio or methodology. Many would agree that students being 1 times as likely or even twice as likely to be identified, placed, or removed because of their disability and their ethnicity is definitely an issue. Well, the state that I left, the methodology is 4.0. So a student being Black with a disability, just walking into the building is 4 times as likely to be suspended, expelled, removed, placed, or identified. And so that's what this conversation is about. And that's what we've been struggling with as a state and as a country for years. Now, Maryland also chose to adopt both the multi-year and reasonable progress flexibility option made available by IDA, offering the LEAs an opportunity to be recognized for improvement. Keep in mind, it's twofold: 2 consecutive years of data and looking for reasonable progress over those 2 years. We generally expect reasonable progress of about 0.15, but if a risk ratio is particularly high, above 4.0, we expect reasonable progress of about 0.50. So there are enforcement actions. If an LEA is found to be significantly disproportionate, the required response includes reserve of funding allocations to address the root causes of this disproportionality. These funds are being held or reserved or allocated to not only for students with disabilities, but even to address some of the systemic issues that are occurring in the general ed setting. Next slide, please. So don't be overwhelmed by this slide. I won't spend too much time on it, just sharing that the application of this methodology impacts the number of LEAs identified with significant disproportionality. And LEA can be significantly disproportionate in the area of any one of these 14 different categories of analysis contained within the 3 overarching buckets of identification, placement, and disciplinary removal, as you see on the left, across each of the 7 different races and ethnicities. That's Asian, Black and African American, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander, Hispanic, or Latino, 2 or more races, American Indian or Alaska Native, and white. As this chart indicates, this creates 98 potential areas in which an LEA can be deemed significantly disproportionate. Next slide, please. So now let's look at where we are currently, like the trends and disproportionality over the past 3 years by category. Currently, we'll see that we have 18 districts who are currently disproportionate or identified for. The diagram shows the number of LEAs identified in our 3 buckets: identification, discipline, and placement. The overlapping areas show LEAs who were significantly disproportionate in more than one bucket. In 2022, 18 LEAs were determined to be significantly disproportionate in 1 or more categories. In 2023, this number decreased to 16 and then increased to 18 in our most recent data. A large driver of this increase is due to the 2020-2021 data that was used in 2023, which will be explained or concerned as lag data, being from the virtual year during COVID-19. As such, the number of LEAs identified with significant disproportionality during that time increased from 2 to 14 over that time period. So if we look at the 2024 data, you can see that 14 of 18 LEAs were identified due to disciplinary removal, and 11 of 18 were identified due to identification. But on a positive note, less LEAs were identified for identification and placement in 2024 as compared to 2023, demonstrating some progress in these areas. Next slide, please. So in the state significant, looking at the disproportionality over the past 5 years, you'll see Maryland has been significantly disproportionate in the identification of Black African-American students as intellectually and emotionally disabled, and the out-of-school suspension of some disciplinary total of Black African-American students. Within identification, the state was significantly disproportionate in the identification of Black African-American students as intellectually disabled and emotionally disabled for 4 consecutive years between 2019 and 2022. The state remains significantly disproportionate in the identification of students as intellectually disabled in most recent data, but lowered the risk ratio below 2.0 for emotional disability. So Maryland was not identified as significantly disproportionate in this subcategory for the first time in 5 years. But within discipline, Maryland has significantly disproportionate in the suspension of African-American students with disabilities in the following categories for 2 consecutive years: out of school suspension, less than or equal to 10 days, out of school suspension greater than 10 days, and then some disciplinary total. Although it appears that progress has been made within each of these categories, it's important to note that the majority of the school year was held virtually in 2020-21 due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it led to affected apparent decreases in the risk ratios in other areas. In the next slide, we'll just take a deeper look into our state data in 3 categories in Maryland that had risk ratios greater than 2.0 in our most recent data: identification of intellectual disabilities among Black African-American students, our out-of-school suspensions, and some disciplinary total for Black African-American students. So Maryland has significantly, as stated, has been significantly disproportionate in the identification of Black African-American students as intellectually disabled since 2018. The state has an average risk ratio of 2.75 in this category over the past 5 years, with Black African-American students consistently being over 2.5 times more likely to be identified as having an intellectual disability compared to their non-Black peers. As you can see in the map to the right, 16 of our LEAs have not been found to be significantly disproportionate in the identification of Black African-American students as intellectually disabled over the past 4 years. But of the 9 LEAs who did demonstrate significant disproportionality, 1 has been significantly disproportionate for 1 year, 2 for 2 years, 2 for 3 years, 3 for 4 years, and 1 for 5 years. And again, this presentation, as you know, will be shared and posted to the website. Next slide, please. As you can, sorry, I can't see my slide myself. Forgive me. In most recent significant disproportionality data, 6 LEAs were significantly disproportionate in the identification of Black African-American students as intellectually disabled. There was Anne Arundel, Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Calvert, Dorchester, and Hartford. An additional 4 LEAs had risk ratios above 2.0, but were not deemed significantly disproportionate due to multi-year reasonable progress flexibility: Caroline, Cecil, Queen Anne's, and St. Mary's. Next slide. As the state of Maryland was significantly disproportionate in the out of school suspension with being greater than 10 days. Black African American students for 2 of the past 5 years, but risk ratios have consistently far exceeded the 2.0 threshold every year, with the exception of the year of the virtual learning. Excluding the 2021 school year, Black African American students with disabilities had an average risk ratio of 4.14 in this category across Maryland, making them, on average, over 4 times more likely to receive suspensions greater than 10 days when compared to non-Black students with disabilities. Although Maryland has been seeing notable decrease in the risk ratio for this category, in our most recent data, we're committed to reducing the risk ratio below the 2.0 threshold, because even with the recent improvement, Black African American students with disabilities are still 3.5 times as likely to receive an out-of-school suspension greater than 10 days compared to their non-Black peers. So 9 LEAs have been significantly disproportionate in this category over the past 5 years. 5 for 1 year and 4 for 2 years. Next slide. Finally, in our most recent data, in terms of for significantly disproportionate out of school suspension greater than 10 days, an additional 4 LEAs had risk ratios above 2.0, but were not deemed significantly proportionate. I think I've already shared that. Forgive me. Is that slide number 23? Forgive me, my glasses. Can we go to the next slide, please? So Maryland has been significantly disproportionate in some disciplinary total of Black African American students in the 3 of the past 5 years. For context, the disciplinary total category is calculated based on a combination of in and out of school suspensions, expulsions, removals by personnel to an interim alternative education setting, and removals by a hearing officer. Excluding the 2021 school year, Black African American students with disabilities have consistently been at least 2 times more likely than their non-Black peers to receive disciplinary action and removal. In examining these data at the LEA level, 16 LEAs have experienced significant disproportionality in this category over the past 5 years for 1 year and 11 for 2 years. Next slide. And in our most recent significant disproportionality data, 6 LEAs were significantly disproportionate in some disciplinary total for Black African American students. That would be Caroline, Hartford, Montgomery, St. Mary's, Somerset, and Worcester. An additional 9 LEAs had risk ratios at or above 2.0, but were not deemed significantly disproportionate due to multi-year reasonable flexibility. Anne Arundel, Baltimore City, Calvert, Carroll, Frederick, Howard, Prince George's, Talbot, and the Seed School. Next slide. So now that I've laid all that heavy data on you and the understanding of why we're doing it, how, and then the impact across the state, now is just a chance to share with you some of the ongoing things that we've done in the state to respond to significant disproportionality. Basically, for MSDE, what we're doing is providing support to the districts. And what we've come to realize over the years is that we have to do more. We have to do some things differently. The things that we've been doing aren't working as designed. And so we have to go back and just provide some of that more ongoing technical assistance to support our local teams. Right now, with them being 18 districts across the state, we need to work with them to engage our diverse stakeholders that's completing the root cause analysis. We recognize that at the core of this, although they have CCIS plans, coordinated comprehensive educational, help me, early intervention system plans, they are required to do a root cause analysis. We are recognizing that across the state, those root cause analysis, who's participating, the outcomes, they're varying. But what is also telling is that there isn't participation, having the right people at the table, having the top-down effect. These things are coming from the special education department. Our directors are overwhelmed. They're being tasked with doing this work. However, what we need to do is to make sure that if you know the understanding out there that this is more than just a special ed concern, it is a general ed concern. Our students with disabilities are general ed first. And so some of the problems and the systemic issues that are there will involve more than just our special ed. So we're conducting the comprehensive reviews of the plans. We're working with them to do their root cause analysis. We're making sure that what's in their plans are aligned with their section 611, 619 funding, that the activities are planned with a programmatic focus. We're helping to facilitate professional development and coaching with the LEAs in their implementation, doing the progress monitoring. We're engaging in like the purpose data-driven decision-making and monitoring progress to ensure the desired plan results are met or adjust to the plan. That's what we're doing, and it's been consistent, and there's documentation to show that, but we need to do some things differently, and we need to maybe just enlist the work that's going on. That concludes this part of the presentation. Next slide. So now it's your turn.
Dr. Hickman, I just
Sure.
wanted to acknowledge there was a comment in the chat from Dee. I don't know if you wanted to recognize that.
There are cyber threats to security.
I would like to, so I can find it while I'm navigating this system. This point came on, that one from D, this point came up in the CSAC meeting. There are schools within an LEA that are significantly disproportionate, but fly under the radar because the entire LEA performs at an acceptable level. How do we provide support for those families who remain unseen and unsupported in this space? Well, we wanted to make sure that, well, we're getting the word out, number one. Number two, I'm working through, well, don't do I. We're working through a process where we're looking for some outside support. We understand that the capacity that we have to address these issues at multiple levels needs some additional support. If there's some conversation, if you want to share that school, we can definitely help the LEA, and we can send a team out to help assist in that.
And
Is there-
Dr. Hick,
Yes.
yeah, I think there was also, earlier, there was a comment from Aggie Callahan asking if there's a mechanism that accounts for the demographics of the jurisdiction or the county. In other words, do the identification numbers mirror disproportionality that exists in the population itself? And Liz did respond to that, but I think this was also more of that conversation.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, Dee's comment was first, and then Ms. Callahan's comment came afterwards, and that's the response.
No, Aggie's came first, and then Liz, and then Dee. But there is some very good conversation going on in the chat.
Okay. Well, great. So what we can do is carry these conversations over to our breakout groups. Next slide. So with our breakout groups, as you know, we've altered the breakout groups to random grouping to ensure everyone has an equal chance to participate. Please make sure that you'll be automatically assigned to a group to move to, except for those in group one. When you receive a notification asking if you'd like to move to the breakout group, please click Move to Breakout. Please use the chat if you have additional comments. Breakout group one will be live streamed and will be recorded and posted on the website. Sign language interpreters will remain in breakout room one and will be live streamed. Each breakout group is assigned an MSDE staff as a note taker. Each breakout group is asked to please identify a facilitator, timekeeper, and reporter. If you do that, as soon as that's the part that many of us have been taking up some time, please go into that group and assign your facilitator, timekeeper, and understand that we have note takers there as well, and who's going to report out. There are 6 total questions this evening. As there is limited time, don't feel that you have to respond to the questions in order, or any of them. I mean, in the order that they come, you can respond as your team deems necessary. Next slide. Please remember our group norms. Speak with care, speak with your own experience, and be mindful of how your comments may impact others. Use I statements and avoid speaking for or generalizing whole groups. Please listen respectfully. Avoid interrupting the person speaking, and talk that evaluates, judges their comments. Please limit your comments to 1 to 2 minutes. Understand that there are no right or wrong answers. We want you to lean in, lean back, give your input, and make space for others to do the same. Be aware of your talk time and try to stay on topic. I want to make sure we are a little past time, but we want to give this conversation the appropriate amount of time. It's 5:30?
It was scheduled to end at 5:35, but I think we can probably go to 5:40. But then otherwise we won't have time to debrief.
Okay, so let's go to we'll go to 5:40. Teams, when you go into your groups, please make sure that you go ahead and assign, facilitator, note taker, reporter, and get down to it. All right? See
All
you
right,
soon.
you're going to be moved now into your groups.
Molly, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Can you move to the next slide?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Okay, I don't think I didn't share those questions, but I know takers know, right?
Okay.
All right,
Okay.
is this group
Oh,
one?
I'm so sorry.
No, you're right. This group one?
This is group one. I'm going to serve as the MSDE note taker.
Mhm.
But Kelly, if you could monitor the chat, that would be great. And then that way I can leave my screen up with all the questions on it.
All right, we've been in these groups before. The MSDE staff supposed to sit back and be quiet. I'm going to do that, but I need someone to step up to be the facilitator and someone to agree to be the reporter router.
I will facilitate.
Thank you. I'll be quiet and I'll be your timekeeper. How about that?
Oh, I was going to be the
Oh,
timekeeper.
no, sir. No. Go ahead. You be your timekeeper. I'm going to sit back and listen and learn.
Thank you.
All right, Diane, 5:15. Let's roll.
Okay, 5:15. So let's just jump in feet first with question one. Should Maryland consider revising its methodology in any way in order to more directly target support where it is most needed? I will I will speak up first, as having been part of the original work when we looked at the methodology that we did that became adopted in 2018, and just recent conversations with other directors. We may need to look at revising our methodology. We are the strictest state in terms of identifying significant disproportionality. And there is also a concern among many directors that in terms of our identification for significant disproportionality differs from that from under COMAR, especially as it relates to discipline, which is then often confusing to many administrators when we're trying to talk about disproportionality and trying to get them to really understand what we are looking at.
I know I'm supposed to be quiet, but Diane, tell me, is three, if I'm correct, for Gen Ed is 3.0 per se. So if the change that we made, are you saying to either we change ours to 3.0 or on the general ed side, they change theirs to 2.0?
I just think some alignment so that there is again, right, Comar's law just relates to discipline. It does not relate to the placement or the LRE, but just kind of that general consensus and that alignment so that we are all talking the same language, so that we know that when a system or a school has been identified for as disproportionate, that we all know what we're talking about.
That makes sense. Yeah, Diane, this is Renette. Oops, I'm sorry.
No, it's
Sharon.
okay.
Well, I thank you, because as I was listening to you, Diane, I was trying to follow where the disconnect was between gen ed and special ed, right?
Me too.
And I appreciate that, because we really do want the data to be as apples to apples, right? And if we're trying to, because I mean, the data doesn't lie, right? The discipline is just, the numbers are not good, right? So, you know, I think an alignment is good. And I sometimes wonder, because I also wonder about that, from a technical assistance standpoint, is that flexibility piece, like 1 year, if you're over and the next year you're over, but if you've decreased, you know, I sometimes wonder, how do we wrap more supports around this, right? So that we can address this issue of disproportionality. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I'm always about what is more support, not less, right? And not punishing. Or being punitive, I should say.
Did somebody else have a comment?
I was just kind of also going back to that gen ed piece, and just you know, working very closely with one of our high schools that that we do struggle with this, and working with the administrators that have kind of different set of guidelines for gen ed and special ed. I think just having that more clear would be helpful, so that we're all on the same page.
Could one of you guys give an example in layman terms? I'm going back to the pre-reading to try to understand the difference. I think when the first person spoke, you said that because there's a difference in what Comar is requiring and what the LEAs are interpreting or doing, that there's a disconnect. Can you give me like just a real live example of that?
Yes, let me under Maryland law, identification of discipline disproportionality occurs when a school meets or exceeds a 3.0 risk ratio on two measures. The comparison of the removal of student groups within the school, and then a comparison to the state percentage number, right? So that is it's a higher risk ratio, and you're looking at just the percentage of a group within that school compared to the state average, right? Where for special ed identification, it's a 2.0 risk ratio, and you're looking at comparison of students with disabilities within that system to students without disabilities.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you. That really clarified for me. Thank you.
Yep. And so, you know, this the Comar law came into being years after the federal requirement for significant disproportionality. But all right, so timing wise, let's go into question 2. What recommendations do you have on specific steps that MSDE can take to help LEAs reduce disproportionality? Again, I'll be the first to speak. I just think a stronger partnership and probably a stronger message from the entire department of MSDE as it relates to disproportionality. Again, just recent conversations. Students with disabilities or general education students first. We know that a tendency to over-refer leads to greater identification rates. And many of us are kind of fearful with the new perspective of retention at grade 3 if you're not reading on grade level, except if you have an IEP, we'll just drive our referral numbers up, and that over-identification will continue to occur. So just that greater partnership and understanding, so that it's expected that we as a special department at the local level work with other departments. But what does that collaboration look like from the state down in terms of additional technical assistance and guidance from that state level? So what is the collaboration between the departments of at MSDE between special education and, let's say, the elementary reading office, around reading and referrals and model practices that then we could emulate down at the local level. And then even looking at best practices for discipline codes of conduct. Discussion yesterday, we know that students are often referred and suspended at high rates for cutting class. What is a recommendation from MSDE to locals that should that really be in our code of conduct, equal to a suspension?
Well, this is Winifred. Like, do we know why? Like, do we know why we're seeing such a disproportionality? Do we know that? Like, if we're seeing, it was a lot of data, but there was no why behind it, right? So I want to know what we're doing to determine why, so that then we can make some recommendations, because each LEA is very different and unique. And we really need to I need to understand more about why, so that we can make a recommendation that makes sense, right? Because when MSDE goes into help, each LEA is going to be helped in a different way. But I need more than just, I need to understand why.
Just it is. So I will say Dr. Hickman's leadership in the team this year has changed the process for what locals have to do in its application of our CCEIS funds, requiring each LEA to conduct a root cause analysis and to submit that as part of our plan. So I can imagine that they are going to they've collected that data and will kind of summarize that data to take a more statewide approach to what are the root causes across the districts, and to try and find commonalities across the districts under all three areas.
Okay.
But I think that is, Winifred, I think that is a good point for recommendations, is really, again, even from a state perspective, as a state, what are we doing to look at a root cause analysis from the state perspective?
Yeah.
This is Renee, and I'd like to build on this recommendation and back to Winfrey, I wrote that, why, right? What's the why, right? Because the issues of disproportionality are rooted in very multifaceted, long-standing historical
Say the word.
biases.
Say the word, Renee. Just say it.
I mean, it is. It is rooted. It is rooted in all of that, right, Whitford? It really, I mean, it is. But the thing of it is I think one of the other recommendations, besides getting at the why, it is hard work to deal with implicit and explicit bias and racism. It is hard work, and I am on that journey, and I am nowhere near having, where I need to be with it, right, as a white woman. But I think the other piece is a recommendation is, and I'm just always struck by this with our current governor and lieutenant governor, is really one of the recommendations that we really need to also look at is, and this root cause is really authentically engaging our families that this is impacting. I think it's fantastic that MSDE wants to, partner, and I appreciate all of the coaching and the technical assistance. But if we're not authentically engaging families who are the closest to this issue because they are living it day in and day out, they're the ones that are getting the calls to come pick their kids up. I think that's also that really strong partnership that really needs to happen, and it's going to take time. And there's going to have to be a lot of healing.
Renee, and just kind of looking ahead at the questions, we've kind of jumped 3 to 4 in terms of identifying those root causes, right? And I think it gets to having some of those truly honest conversations about what the root cause is, right? We know too, as it relates to discipline, that so many of our infractions are so subjective. And so how do we create, is there a way to create a more objective disciplinary code of conduct and application of that code of conduct so that, I'm not giving a student, just an office referral and maybe a lunch detention for, a minor infraction versus another school that, suspends the student for, for 3 to 5 days.
Well, and Diane, to that point, though, I think we need to back it up even further is what are we looking at is in creating a culture that's a positive, looking at the evidence-based practices around positive behavior supports and restorative practices, right? I think we need to back it up even further to, as well as having the consistency. I couldn't agree with you more.
Well,
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
I would, sorry, Sherry, just to comment real quick. I'd love to, do a correlation of schools that have PBIS and looking at their discipline, because we do have gold star rated schools that are, that have been rated for gold star with PBIS that still have over referral, over identification, in this pro.
You're right. So then we get into fidelity and implementation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was just going to say the same, and exactly, especially when we're looking at younger students that in some schools, they do have just sheets of, dozens of referrals, maybe for small things. And then looking at coming back to those discussions at IEP tables of, they have all of these referrals, we need to look at a more restrictive environment. And that just seems to be always the discussion that takes place with referrals. So, if schools are really struggling with a student and they have the perception that the more referrals that they write, the more leg or, they have to stand on of looking at a more restrictive environment. So really going back to that, and looking at exactly what is this even to this is cutting class even to a suspension, and really looking at those codes of conduct so that we are writing referrals that are really reflective and not subjective.
I would like to add, when we're looking at that, it's all with this disproportionality of like Black boys, we're looking at the behavior and not the academics. Why is this behavior happening?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as a former director of a special education school, I can tell you reading the evaluations, I see a little black boy and a little white boy with the same profile, and the language just used, defiant, right? I didn't see that in one report. So, the focus tends to be on behavior when they're a minority or a black boy versus the academics. Why is this behavior? And so there's this quick thing to reprimand. And that's what just comes to mind with even in the schools that do it well, but then we still see the over referrals, right? As far as the PBIS. So that's I don't know, that's what comes to mind there, is just to focus on the behavior versus the academics.
Well, Winifred, I think that's one of the issues, is that when we're looking at this, it isn't, and I think Diane and I'm so sorry.
Sherry.
Sherry, thank you. Sorry, you moved on my screen. Sorry, Sherry. Is that piece of, it's not just special ed that needs this work, right? It's, it's school psychologists, it's school principals, it's SROs, it's everybody that is really touching the kids or comes in contact with the kids. So it really has to be all of the pieces. It just doesn't need to be just on SPED Ed's shoulders.
And so I think that's a good transition to number 3. And what additional ideas do we have to help address significant disproportionality? We've touched on some of the ones that are suggested there: discipline alternatives, understanding behavior, the different barriers, the high quality evidence-based instructional practices. Once upon a time, MSDE did support a list of different evidence-based interventions that were available. And I think perhaps sharing that, I know we in Anne Arundel County, for example, are struggling with like math, with evidence-based math interventions, and writing interventions, and just what are some other good behavioral interventions. We know about restorative practices, but also what do they look like with fidelity?
I agree. I think that's an important part, is having a list. I mean, we've done that as well, restorative practices in one of our schools. It lasted for a couple of years, but to have, different interventions and maybe possibly more training on those, because again, each school is different.
And make sure
No, go ahead, Renee.
Thank you, Sherry, because I think what I think you just shared there about, we did restorative practices and it was good for a couple of years, right? So chances are, I'm guessing, I don't think I'm going to be too far off, there was a change in leadership, right?
Yes.
Yep. And so,
yes.
yeah,
and the specialist, yes.
Yes.
Yep.
So it's like, okay, so it's this, there does need to be this, to use an OSEP term, what is this continuous, not monitoring, what is this continuous, what's the mechanism, right? Because we know a principal changes and the whole tone of a school building can change, right? Or, not just to put it always on the principal, it could also be an assistant principal, right? It can be lots of factors with that. So I think when we think about that is, what those are some of the things of, okay, so what, okay, wait a minute, we're getting ready to get a new administration change in this building. Okay, all right, what do we need to do, and go back and be proactive about the pieces that are working, right? So that we can keep them working.
And I think there's alignment to this work with kind of what we talked about several sessions ago, and what we're doing for our pre-service teachers and even our teachers that are going for master's degrees. So what courses are we offering at the university and college level for future administrators, for future counselors, for future general education teachers to understand their role in this, and what is this impact, and how do they contribute to it negatively, and how do they contribute to it positively?
Mm-hmm.
Alrighty, we're going to 5:40, so I think we've got like 6 minutes left. Anything else on questions 1 through 4? All right, let's look at 5. How do we ensure structured systemic changes that are not culturally void and take the diversity of Maryland's classrooms into account?
Well, I think we've talked a lot about a lot of these pieces. I think the only thing I'd like to offer, and it's just I think words, to me, words matter, right? And what we do. And so I really would love number 5 to have said that are not culturally void and embrace the diversity of Maryland's classrooms into account. Because I think that's the beauty of Maryland, is we are so diverse, and the number of languages and the people that are coming to our state all the time. I think if we look at it as embracing, it's just a more inclusive way of looking at it.
I would agree, Renee, because as diverse as we are, we're also very segregated. Right? And that is just simply a fact.
Yep.
So that embracing the different cultures, because culture plays a whole part in the communication with the educator and a child. And
It
one
sure does.
culture might say this or react this way, and another culture is totally different. Taking the time to really embrace. I like that, Renee. So that you said that way nicer than I was thinking. I'm trying to come up with a way, like, I don't like culturally void.
Yeah, well, I don't like that. I think it's also respecting, being culturally responsive or culturally competent, right? But I mean, it's also, how do you embrace that when you're working with families, right? I mean, that's all we do is serve families across the state. And how I talk about disabilities with one culture is different than how I talk about it with another one, right? And if I don't learn how to do that, then I've lost a family. And if I lose a family, I just can't, right? We just can't do that.
And with the collaboration, embracing it, if you can't say it, you can come to me. Hey, Winifred.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
working
collaboratively, and that's a form of embracing it. I'm not getting through. I don't know how to get through. I've tried everything. What can I do differently? Let me ask someone else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I ask that question a little bit differently? Just so I can walk away. I'm not getting the answer. I'm not getting the answer that I'm needing for number 5. I think it's written. If we take out, so let's take out 2 words, because number 3, how do we ensure structured systemic changes that? So we take that out. So first, how do we ensure structured systemic changes are not culturally void and embrace the diversity of Maryland's classrooms into account? Help us. How do we do that?
Well, I think, Dr. Hickman, that was what we were just sharing, is that that there were bits and pieces of how we answered that embedded in all of the other questions. So I apologize. I was not the note taker, so I didn't write down everyone's brilliant words.
Oh, no problem. I mean, I was getting what you said. Oh, Molly.
Molly said she did.
I was gonna say, I can assure you, Molly captured everything quite well.
Thank you, Molly.
One thing that I think is, looking at, and it's getting better, like, what does that coaching model look like from the state level to the system level? You have, I'm going to just use Blueprint as an example. We have these Blueprint monitoring teams that are going out as teams looking at whole schools, whole systems. And again, it's not just one view. You know, do we need does MSDE need to take that bigger picture look when they're helping support a system to provide some of that coaching? Because, you know, we are so diverse. And as an example, in a conversation yesterday, you have a smaller county whose CCEIS funds you know, amount to like $75,000 that they have to report, you know, allocate towards their efforts, versus Anne Arundel County, where we're over $1 million. We have the same problem we're addressing. So you know, how do we tackle that, given some of those restraints and difficulties, and encourage the collaboration across county lines.
I also will want to add, because I really want to try to, Dr. Hickman, like answer what you're saying. And how do we ensure to always keep this at the forefront, right? Mm-hmm. To keep this going, because we know in education, once leadership changes, everything changes, right? And it has to come top down, right? So to keep this in everything that we're doing, like to look at this and make sure that everything that we're doing is addressing this, because it's such a great need in the state of Maryland. So that's what MSDE can do to ensure that in everything we do, that we're keeping this at the forefront, to make sure we're ingraining it, and over years and other LEAs will pick up with this, because we know there's so much change that happens, and then the whole culture shifts, right? But this needs to become a part of Maryland's culture. It needs to become the norm.
And using data
directly.
Oh, sorry, Winfred. And using data.
Yeah.
Using consistent data, so that these are data-driven decisions.
To show that improvement, you know, looking at the numbers, that data that you presented today was very powerful. So.
Did that help, Dr. Hickman?
That did help. And we're going to see if it helped now that everyone's back. So Renee, are you the reporter? I'm just messing with you.
Probably. I did not take notes, Dr. Hickman.
Okay. All right. Next slide, please, Molly. Ms. Connor, that is. Thank you so much. All right, welcome back, everyone. Looking at the time, we have 20 minutes, and I think we can do this and make sure that we have the group's voices heard. We had four groups, and I'm sure that you jump right into the work and you have a reporter ready to report out. We're going to go with question number 1. Should Maryland consider revising its methodology for identifying SIGDIS in any way in order to more directly target support where it is most needed? Now, there were 4 groups. Group 1.
That's your group, Dr. Hickman.
Then, all right.
So there was discussion around that this should be yes, that there should be some alignments with our COMAR identification of significant disproportionality, so that we're sending clear messaging about what it truly means to be significantly disproportionate, and just understanding too, from an administrative perspective, what are we truly looking at?
Awesome. Would the next group like to chime in on that?
Hi, this is Lisa Melody. I'm going to apologize because we sort of took your offer of talking about lots of different things all at one time.
Okay.
So, but I think ultimately we ourselves weren't sure. We, again, talked a lot about that it's super important to have these conversations and to look at where the concerns are. But I think the other piece of it is ultimately being clear about, we're not just trying to reduce a number, but that we're trying to make sure that there are practices, policies, structures in place that look at kids individually and figure out what they need from there, whether it is special ed or not, but then, you know, and where, if it is, would be the best place to, you know, have them serve. So I just decided that I don't do math really well, so I wasn't really sure.
Understood. Thank you. Anyone else want to speak to that? Group 3.
This is Erica Levy. One of the things that we talked about was we talked about a lot of different things. I'm sorry. With regard to the methodology, we discussed data collection, how data is collected, and then the analyses, and that takes a special kind of person to kind of understand that. Some of us don't know data, some of us do understand data, but we weren't really sure how to change or what should be changed either. One question that I had was why we were being so stringent with the 2.0, but it was explained to us why it was decided. We also discussed using evidence-based practices. What are other states using? And is it a way for MSDE to provide us guidance in the LEAs, and then also with our action plan, and then also monitor those guidance or monitor those plans for the LEAs. We also discussed students. One of the things that kind of came up in our group is discussing, you know, students come from different backgrounds, and so what might work in one LEA might not necessarily work in another LEA because there's different needs in all across the state of Maryland. And also within LEAs, there's different needs. And I think we didn't get to the other questions, but I think I kind of summed everything up. I'm not sure if anybody else in my group would like to add anything.
Anyone from that group 3 anymore? Okay, I think we'll go to group 4. What we're going to do is group 4. Do you have anything to add to question number 1?
So like the last group, hi, this is Joanne Hoffman reporting out for our group. It's hard for me to kind of break apart our answer into questions 1, 2, or 3, you know, just break them down that way. But what we did talk about is, yes, that we do feel that the methodology should be revisited. There's a question or concern about why general education would have a different percentage point than special education in regards to perhaps suspensions, and the need for everybody to be working towards the same percentage goal, et cetera, because students before they were special education were general education students. So if we're all working towards a common goal, there shouldn't be a difference in what the possibility or the threshold for suspensions. Also looking at, is there a way to get more current data when we're addressing plans to work more efficiently, to work better, to address these disproportionality rather than using our lagging data? Because we're looking at using data for improvement plans that was a year or 2 years ago. So that sometimes doesn't make the most sense. And then I'll leave it at, and I guess I'll leave it at that for right now, and then I can jump back in later about how MSDE can help with that.
Actually, what we're going to do because of time, will you go ahead and share?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So we talked about, since MSDE had created their identification checklist for SLD and ID, why not create one for all the disabilities that would be used by all the districts? So we're all working towards, you know, using the same information, the same data, you know, the same data collection, going through a process. We also talked about how that it's important to really do a root cause analysis, because before you can make any changes, you really need to understand what is causing the disproportionality. Could be a matter of the need for professional development, changing expectations, addressing bias issues. We also talked that at the county level, breaking it down by having all kinds of different offices involved in creating these plans, working together, supporting the schools to support students, and really taking that deep dive all the way down to the individual student level. So that's what we had.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond to any of the questions, but specifically, well, I say any of the questions, then I'm going to go specifically. I need give us some guidance on what you think. What did you come up with as recommendations for us, MSDE? Group one, I'm calling you out.
Now I've got to remember that discussion. Molly, I'm going to call Molly out. Molly, as our note taker, do you any of the highlights? I think from our discussion.
Sure. So one thing you guys talked a lot about was a need for more unification in terms of how general education students and special education students are found eligible for DisPro, and a more unified message would be very helpful there. You also mentioned looking at you discussed how the blueprint team goes out and looks at things as a whole, and that it would be helpful if we took a similar approach for other areas in MSDE. Those were the two big things, I think.
Thank you. Group two, would you like to respond to any questions, something that we need to know that we can carry with us?
Liz, would you talk about that Ohio program? And Lisa, would you address what you were talking about silos?
Sure. One of the things we talked about was some different ways that we might encourage districts to use their CCEIS money that gets held in reserve when a district is found significantly disproportionate. And one, I had shared a conversation I'd had with some folks who work in Ohio about how they embed related service providers for chunks of time in every kindergarten, first grade classroom in the early grades. And they do that so that those folks can both do screening at the beginning of the year to kind of get a read on what's happening in a classroom, but also to support that teacher to really universally design their classrooms, and that they've actually seen identification of students for special ed decrease by doing that, because they're giving kids right on time kind of support. And, the teachers are also getting sort of additional training in thinking of, building up their toolboxes in terms of the kinds of supports that they can embed within their classrooms and their instruction. And that might be a way to do some early intervening services in a way that's, a staffing model that's not, that current funding doesn't really support, but that might be an interesting strategy.
Awesome.
Lisa?
I think I feel like we've had this this has been involved in a lot of conversations. I know it has in my current system, but it's still living in those silos. It's like everybody has their initiative, not recognizing that everybody should be working for, the same thing. So one of the things that I had mentioned were, our multi-language learners who, a lot of times we don't know how to help them based on their history before they came to us. Did they have any formal education, whatever? And so the first thing they do is get recommended to be evaluated for special ed. So, why are we, why aren't general ed and special ed also communicating and having great conversations more closely related with, and I apologize because I know they're not all like ESOL, like those departments, but we are piecemealing kids' needs by not looking holistically at what's happening. So we're seeing, I think, the effects of that come out in lots of different types of disproportionality because, we're not looking at the kid as a whole or the situation as a whole.
And I think they were applying it also in lots of specialized programs where if you're ED, you go here and you go here and you go here, and this is your expertise and this is your expertise. And
yeah, it's about looking at a kid and being like, oh, here's that diagnosis, there's this. Okay, you fit this package, you're going to go there, even though that may or may not be, maybe parts of it there would be great for what they need, but So it's really not looking at the needs of kids. It's just looking at where can we put them? And not with a bad intention in their heart, but just it's not as individualized as we would like it to be, because I'm still not really sure there truly is a continuum of services available to students.
It's good. Thank you for that feedback. Is there one more group that would like to share? We have time for one more to respond to any of the questions your
Yes,
team
sir.
wants you to share. Go ahead, Erica.
As we talked about using evidence-based practices, like best practices, I'm sorry. So if we could look, if MSDE could look at states that aren't over-identifying or aren't disproportionate, what are they doing that's different than what we're doing? Is it possible to look at some of the LEAs, because not all of the LEAs are disproportionate? What are they doing that maybe some of the other districts could, or some of the other LEAs could adopt? I think that was it. Just trying to figure out what the people who are doing it correctly, what they're doing, and can we do that? Thank you.
Thank you as well.
Dr. Hickman.
Yes.
Hey, this is Bess Cropper. I want to make a statement. You know, I commend Maryland for being one of the most restrictive states with their 2.0 risk ratio. I think that's a great thing. I just want to reiterate what Joanne said. I think that gen ed and special ed should be held to the same standard because it starts in gen ed. Everything starts in gen ed. Every child is a gen ed student first. But I also think that when we're putting out PR for this, we also need to realize that Alabama, I mean, everybody should go to OSEP. Everybody that's on this call should go to OSEP and look at the different states and look at what their methodology is for significant disproportionality, because it's different across the entire nation. So when you're comparing two states, a state that has a risk ratio of 4.0, it's going to, and they look like they're not significantly disproportionate. When you dig down deep in their data, they're worse than Maryland because Maryland uses a 2.0 risk ratio and their methodology is different. So I just think we need to be careful and make sure that, you know, Maryland, I commend Maryland for that. I think it's great that, and we should do that. We should have no child should be suspended more than another child. You know, we shouldn't do that based on anything. It's wrong. And I think we can all say that. But I think we also need to look at that PR and how we're putting that information out, because when you dig deep, we are one of the most restrictive states in the nation.
Thank you. And the appropriate response is 1 of 4 with a stringent methodology. Okay, friends, thank you very much for your sharing, your participation, and your feedback. Of course, our note takers will gather the information and we'll be sharing that out with you. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right. So as we wrap up and close, I've already shared, you're going to make sure that you get the feedback as well. We know that we receive a number of recommendations over time, and we definitely owe a report to the special ed work group on our progress on our recommendations. I shared with you last month that we were looking at the way that we've been going month to month, topic by topic, and at the end, we've ended up with a recommendation or 2 each time. And so we're somewhere around 14 recommendations. And what we grew to see that process was working, but in terms of prioritizing, putting one in front of the other, is really not the way that we saw this playing out. There are a number of things that are interconnected in terms of the topic, but also interconnected in terms of responsibility and getting to the goal. So what we want to do, we're going to do, you should be receiving some things for August. We want to convene some small groups. What MSDE will do is provide like what we've seen as like a prioritization of the recommendations so far, share them with you in advance, and then have some smaller group conversations like we did several months ago. Last month, you may have received the invitation, and then we pulled it back because we weren't ready. What we want to do is just have an overview of the prioritization. There'll be a called meeting Friday, August 9th at 10 a.m. We promise not to keep you no longer than 45 minutes, but we are scheduled for hours, so we promise not to keep you any longer than an hour. Just to give you an overview of what the recommendations are, remind you of where they are, and then share with you, our priorities and prioritization lists from our respects, so that we can get some things done that will be, short term, some things we're working on now, long term, and a little bit longer. Then we're going to ask you to register for one small group conversation, and we're not going to put you in groups, and we'll just be making this available to you. You'll notice that on the schedule, Wednesday, August 21st, that is our next scheduled special education work group. But we've received a number of calls and questions asking, well, some saying they won't be able to attend, but asking to postpone. So what we are going to do is we're going to postpone the Wednesday, August 21st meeting. So there won't be an August meeting, but for those that can attend and you already have it in your schedule, we will convene two small groups during that already scheduled time. Hope that makes sense. But if you're looking at the slide, Friday, August 9th, we'll have a 45-minute overview. We're providing 5 additional opportunities for you to join a group to give us feedback on the priorities, and then we'll bring that back to you. Questions? All right, next slide, please. So as I shared the exit ticket, you will receive your exit ticket with answers, giving you another opportunities to respond to the questions that should come out tomorrow. Is that correct? All right, good. Thank you.
Sorry, yes, it'll come out tomorrow.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so these are the questions that you'll be receiving, similar to the ones you have, but we really want to make sure that we have your information so that when we come back with a recommendation, that we can pretty much get some consensus. Next slide. As mentioned, the Wednesday, August 21st meeting is canceled. Our next meeting, full meeting, is going to be Wednesday, the 25th. We will definitely share via email what the times are available for the small groups, and we're moving forward from there. Ms. Zogby, do you have anything in closing?
The only thing I have is, I think the conversation today around the proposed recommendation was good conversation, and just points out how important it is that we get that feedback in exit tickets. That's how we're building recommendations. So please do respond to the exit ticket in writing and give us all that rich feedback so that we can circulate that to you and come up with some recommendations around this really important topic.
Thank you for that. And I do agree that it's important that we have the convening, that we give time for voice. We need to hear from you. It's important that these 50 or more participants have a chance to share with us what we need to do for MSDE, and then also our LEAs can take some things back to their schools, and we need your support. So we appreciate it, and appreciate today's conversation on significant disproportionality, which we know can be very tense. It's trying, and speaks to all areas of just from race to disability to just justice and equity. And so those are difficult conversations to have. But I look forward to furthering this work and knowing that we can tackle this together and we can narrow the gap. So with that said, there's not another slide. That's a conclusion, right? Fantastic. All right. Thank you very much. You all have a great night.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.